So those are the two correlations. Now let's take a look for a minute here about, oh by the way, it's also interesting, forgive me, I forgot the point yet. So they come into that, they understand the power of the tree, which is to convert the negative into the positive, and then immediately after that, they come to the 12 pools of water, which Rashi points out are the 12 tribes, but the meaning of the 12 tribes, as we know according to Mem Loez and many other sources, when the sea split, it's split in 12 paths. In other words, there are 12 different ways for each one of the nations to relate to Torah. And not only that, there are each ways that each of us relate to the Torah. So there is the idea of the Torah, each designed for who we are. And then there are the 70 palm trees, which is Shivim Panim the Torah, the 70 faces of the Torah. And therefore, that idea is one can elevate and reach the palm branch, the palm fruit, which is at the very top. The Gemara Pesachim goes a little bit further on this, and it says, Rashi points out in the Gemara Pesachim, it says that the palm tree is also a symbol of Torah, besides the symbol of the tzaddik, because palm trees have a heart and a spine. That is what makes a mensch. Not just how much they learn, but they have a heart of compassion, and they have a spine because they are ethical and they are upright. The Gemara also adds that in Yericho, they used to actually feed palm trees by injecting them with a special combination of barley, myrtle, and berry juice. In case you guys have like any palm trees in your backyard and you really want a little something for Shabbos. So again, the idea of the sustenance of the palm tree and the palm tree correlating with the tzaddik. The Gemara Sukkah says a little bit further, it says by Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when talking about how great he is, the Gemara talks about the languages he understood. And it says he understood the language of the angels, of the demons, and of the palm trees. He also understood the parables of the foxes and the laundry man. Right? We all know the mystery of the laundry man. No tiki, no shirty. So there was the mysteries of all these languages. Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai. By the way, I don't know why this popped into my head, but I'll just throw this out to completely distract me with the non sequitur. But like in the hippie, anti-Vietnam War days and everything, so the Americans were like justifying that they were going to Vietnam because of the oil interests in the ocean and so on. And Jerry Rubin, who was like one of the original Chicago 7 real, revolutionary anti-Vietnam War guys, he said, how would America react if the Chinese sent gunboats up the Mississippi, like Chinese coming out of the Mississippi all over the place to protect their laundry interests? So, okay, sorry, never mind, back to our show. So, what about the cedar tree? The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says that there are actually 10 types of cedar trees. Again, 10 is the sphere of the Omer. The idea of being mashlim is always the idea of 10, of completion, thus the correlation to the tzaddik of the 10 types. The Gemara in Zvachim tells a very interesting story here. Rashi actually says here that there were certain fig trees that when they built the Beit HaMikdash, they found fig trees. There's a certain din, when you want to bring wood that's burnt on the altar in the Beit HaMikdash, that wood could never have been used in work. Similar to wood, like for example, in building the skach of a sukkah, could have never had a nail and so on and so on. So when they built the Beit HaMikdash, they found a whole forest of fig trees that were never worked, and the wood was then brought and used on the Mizbeach. And the Gemara in Zvachim says that that forest was planted by the first man, because he knew that someday there would be the Beit HaMikdash, and there would be the need for this wood. Now this ties back to what we said before. We're going to see this now. The 3 possible fruits of the original sin of man, one of them was the fig tree. So Adam, in understanding that ultimately the third Beit HaMikdash, which correlates to the third Geula of Tu B'Shvat, would be somehow being able to bring the fig in service of God, as opposed to in service of the revolution, by allowing it to be part of the altar. And we find actually that all 3 are used in the Beit HaMikdash. There was the wine for the libation, and there's the wheat for the menachos, for the offerings, and now there's the fig for the wood on the altar. All 3 of them are utilized. And the Gemara says as well that we also know, coming back now to the cedar tree, that when the Jewish people were going down into Mitzrayim, coming out of Mitzrayim 200 years later, how did they build all of their wagons? They had all the cedar wood, Where was the cedar wood? They had brought the cedar wood with them when they came down into Egypt, because it says that Yaakov built the cedars in order that someday, 200 years later, they would have this wood to enable them to build the wagons when they came out of Mitzrayim. So again, it's all about tikkun, and the idea really is that Yaakov is the face that sits on the throne of God. Yaakov is the ultimate mensch. Yaakov therefore represents emet, and Yaakov therefore is the cedar, which is the tzaddik. He planted the seeds so that the nation would be able to elevate themselves, and we'll see in 2 more seconds, from the level of an olive tree to the level of the cedar tree. And just one more point on cedars though. The Gemara brings in Brachos a very esoteric idea. It says that there was once a cedar tree that fell, and it was so long, it was 16 wagons side by side long. Now, I don't want to get too much into this, but the idea of 16 is a very deep idea in Kabbalah, because 16 is Yud Kei Vav Kei, but without the Yud. It's the 2 hands and it's the body. The 16 always represents the idea of the doing. The Yud is the idea of idea, but the 16 is the idea of doing. And therefore, the idea of the cedar tree, in just one level, of course, here, as an analogy of being 16 wagons long, because, right, we tied it back to Yaakov planting cedar trees that would ultimately become wagons that would be able to elevate the lost 49 level of Tuma Neshamas to start their ascent all the way up to the 50th level of Tahara at Mount Sinai. Those wagons are the body. They're the Merkavet, which brings the Shekhinah, and therefore, that's what that idea of the cedar represents, the tzaddik, because the tzaddik can rise above everything. Now, in normal Jews, unlike the tzaddikim, the Gemara says in Menachos that the Jews are compared to olive trees. Why? Because just like olive trees, and I don't really know what this means, in the end bear fruit, so too the Jews will finally find their true success in the end when Mashiach comes. That somehow we will never reach the real success that we all seek and obtain on a national level until we reach this final level of third Beit HaMikdash, of ultimate Geula, of the idea of Mashiach. And the Gemara also says to compare to olive trees, because just like an olive tree does not release its oil without being crushed, so too sometimes for the average Jew, it's only that wake-up call of being crushed that all of a sudden we see the light. You know, I think I said this last class about Noah. If you think about Noah, 120 years he's preaching about this flood. All of a sudden there's the flood. According to one pshat in the Zohar, God held his head against the window of the ark so he should see everybody like, scratching the window, dying, drowning. He wasn't exempt from their pain. And all of this, and then all the stories, the lion biting him, the stink, the smell, everything with the animals, and who knows what. Finally, the door kicks open. He walks out, kind of like the Christians, with a little cloud and a beam of light comes down on him. And what's the first thing God says to him? He says, now that I have your undivided attention. Like there's sometimes we're so busy and so involved in our world that God forbid that Hashem has to karate chop all the things that happen in our lives only just to get us to go, in order to be able to look up to heaven and have that conversation with God. So we talked about before, the man in the field. It's about praying to God, overcoming our circumstances by being able to pray to God. Okay, just a couple little side points because I think they're really cool about trees. For example, the Gemara in Sota, believe it or not, in Talmudic time, the Gemara says there were bonsai trees, and the Gemara says that the height of the bonsai tree was a tefach, so the trees, I guess, were about this big, and they actually bore fruit. So that was just kind of a little interesting side note that caught my eye here. And then there's another one in Chulin, which is actually very cool. I have to tell you, does anybody, I know some people do, but does everybody know a person here lives around the corner named Rabbi Joe Schoenwald? Okay, so I was once walking through Independence Park many years ago in Jerusalem. There had been a horrific hailstorm, and many trees had been destroyed. I mean, it was a big, all the parks, the forests were really heavily destroyed. And he and I were cutting through, and he was looking at the trees, and he turned and he said to me, he said, Hashem, in his chesed, he brought whatever was deserving on the trees instead of on us. And there was one tree that was kind of cracked and bent over, and the the trunk was exposed. And I'm not talking now from a halakhic point of view. I don't judge people. There's only one judge, and it's not me. And he goes over and he put his hands, he's a Kohen, he put his hands and leaned on the trunk and said Kaddish for the trees. I was like blown away by that. I thought, that's a very beautiful thing to see. He actually felt the pain of the trees. You know, of course, his hands were stuck from the sap. No, I'm just kidding. But he really felt that pain. It was a very beautiful, touching thing. So the Gemara Chulin says, it says that if you have a sick tree, the Gemara says you should paint it red. So when people will go by, they'll see this tree painted red, and they'll realize, it's a sick tree, so that people will pray for the tree. See, it's Gemara. Okay. Now we're going to kind of wrap it up here a little bit, and then we're going to get to the little page that's attached to it. The idea now is really, we know there's a concept that's discussed often in regards to tefillah, which is called somech geula legeula. To place one redemption should roll into the other. We have this idea in Pirkei Avot, mitzvah goreret mitzvah, that one commandment brings another commandment. But it's also the idea of geula, geula, geula. So we find that we know the first Geula is obviously the Geula of Yetziat Mitzrayim, Passover. And Yetziat Mitzrayim is the idea of revelation of God in the world for everybody. Not just in the inner circle of those that understand, which is what Hashem says to Moshe when he says, I only revealed myself to your forefathers in the name of Shekai, because I showed them my inner workings in how I run the world, and that was enough for them to get it. But now I'm going to blast it out of the park, and I'm going to use the name Havaya, because now everybody, even Egyptians, everybody in the world will see clearly that there's God. So the first redemption, which seems to be the most magnanimous, the most amazing, the like God blowing everything asunder, is actually the least of the three. Because the idea of seeing God in your face is not so good as a human being, right? People often say, well, if there's God, let God do a miracle or whatever. I mean, needless to say, we are swimming in endless miracles. But no, let me see a miracle out of the norm and so on and so on. Well, if that happens, we lose our free will. We become robots. There's no longer that, yes, no. It's obvious what's going on, which is the process we go through in life. When we're little children, we make decisions. We get older, we realize that's a stupid decision. You don't have to weigh it anymore. You're not making that decision anymore. Now you're making a new level decision, and so on and so on and so on. So therefore, the first revelation of God as outright revelation was only the beginning, the least of them all. The greater revelation of that is the next one of Purim. Because Purim is absolute revelation without being any revelation. It's revelation of the mastery of God over the minutiae of history. That when there's no vision of God, like we said at the beginning of the class, it's completely revealed. It's Megaleh in the star. It reveals that which is hidden. So therefore, the next level of it is where man has to really understand that there's God. And in hindsight, i.e. the story of Megillah, it creates a phenomenon where it's unbelievable. Look how this happened, and that happened, and this happened because of that, and this. I mean, and we had these in our lives as well. I mean, like, my gosh, this guy did that, and all of a sudden he knew this person who was... I mean, that's how it is. God can be revealed in the way that the world works is a greater revolution than God overriding the way that the world works. I think we talked about this also last time. I said that by us, we're enchanted with Kabbalah, because Kabbalah is like, ooh, it's like, ooh, and we go, ooh, up into the higher world, and ooh, I'm really out there. But what's God's Kabbalah? God's not impressed with that stuff. That's like his backyard. God's Kabbalah is when somebody hands a coin to a poor person. That's awesome. Down here in this opaque world of darkness, who even knows if there's God, let alone that God communicates, let alone that God communicates specifically what I should do, let alone that my life really has, I'm not just like an inflated vegetable, but my life has meaning. And now all of a sudden, amongst this incredible darkness, I can bring Torah or Ner Mitzvah through doing an act of kindness to another person. The point which is the furthest, Kavayachal of course, the furthest from God, that blows God's mind, if you will. Because God doesn't deal in quantity, he deals in quality. So it's not about size, Because size is meaningless. Remember when you were like learning math and the teacher put a line going in two directions, and then they put a ray going in one direction, and they asked which was longer, and then, it's the line? What are you talking about? Because it goes in both directions. And the answer is no, they're equal. And of course you went nuts. Well, what about on the ray, all this stuff? But it's infinite, so they're equal. So as far as God's concerned, there is no such thing as size. It's about meaning. So therefore, a totally insignificant little teeny ant-like thing called human on a speck of dust called earth could be the most important thing in the all of creation. That little thing should lock in to Ratzon Hashem and become a vav that brings that into this world. That's God's Kabbalah. And therefore, that becomes the highest level of redemption. And this is the redemption of Tu B'Shvat, where it comes, not only do we see the revelation of God through the non-revelation of God, but we even see the revelation of God in the very fabric of the thing which was created to hide God, nature. That's what we talked about before. Because Zohar says when God created the world, it's funny, I'm coming back to the talus after I started this story. I mentioned earlier I almost got blinded today by somebody with their whipping their talus in my eye. But God, I'm sure didn't whip it in anybody's eye, but God, the Zohar says, God took a talus of light and wrapped it. Now, what happens when you wrap a talus, besides you knock out the eye of the guy next to you? What happens when you do the talus is you hide, in a way, the person inside of you. That's why if you look at creation, you look at the word of talus as beged. Beged is from Lashon Boged, the rebel. And it's hiding the aleph. It's Bet Gimel Dalet, but no aleph. Yet, ironically, if you see somebody naked, depending on who they are, you either get sick or go, wow. But if you see somebody naked, you don't really see them. You just see, like, body. But when you see somebody wearing clothing, which ironically hides their body, it reveals who they are. Right? Because clothing is a statement. So the very thing which hides the person reveals the person. Because by the way that they choose to dress in clothing, choose to dress in the way they speak, choose to dress in the way they act, choose to dress in the way they think, all these dressings are revelations of who really is inside that person. So therefore, the greatest this is the irony, as Reb Soloveitchik always says, don't call it the Garden of Paradise, rather call it the Garden of Paradox. The irony is that which hides God the most, nature, is the ultimate in which reveals God. Because once you come to that level of realizing that there is none but God, then you come to the realization that there is no such thing as nature. And I want to just take 1 second, I'm going to go to the pages that were handed out. I have to read you because it blew my mind. I'll just do it in English. I didn't even bring the Hebrew. This is the Ramban in the very end of last week's Parsha, where he's talking about tefillin. See here what it said? Okay, so also make sure I didn't staple them out of order. That would be very uncomfortable. Okay, we're good. So here. This is a very long Ramban, and now at the end of a very long Ramban is the wind-up. He says like this, kind of as a joking about when Michael walked in the door. He said, and that is in fact the ultimate objective of creation itself. So we're not going to go to that part that he wrote about that before, because who really cares, right? So, but he goes on, he says, for we have no other explanation for the first creation, and the Most High has no desire for his earthbound creatures, right? Again, God has no interest in human beings except for this, that man should know and acknowledge to his God that God created him. That's the bottom line. And the purpose of raising one's voice in prayers, which doesn't mean screaming out loud, by the way. It means elevating one's prayers. And the purpose of synagogues and the merit of communal prayer is this, that people should have a place where they can gather and acknowledge to God that he created them and caused them to be, and where they can publicize this and declare before him, we are your creations. This is the intent of the sages in when they said, explaining a verse in the book of Yonah, and they shall call out mightily to God, which is by the sailors. From here, the word mighty, you learn that prayer requires a loud voice, for boldness can overcome evil. And then he concludes, through recalling and acknowledging the great manifest miracles of the Exodus a person will ultimately acknowledge the hidden miracles of everyday life. He's showing how the Yetziat Mitzrayim is only a finger pointing to what we're talking about, where we can, through those unbelievable miracles, reach a higher level of seeing daily hidden miracles in everyday life, which are the foundations of the entire Torah. For a person has no share in the Torah of Moshe, our teacher, unless he believes that all our affairs and experiences are miracles. That there is no element of nature and the ordinary course of the world, which he puts in quotes here, in them at all. Read that again. That there is no element of nature and the ordinary course of the world in them at all, whether regarding the community or the individual. Rather, if one observes the commandments, his reward will bring him success, and if he transgresses them, his punishment will destroy him, because all are by decree of the Most High, as I have already mentioned, and the hidden miracles, the vehicles of this reward and punishment, can be more clearly recognized as regards the affairs of a community, meaning what we would call history, as appears in the predictions of the Torah in the matter, and the blessings and the curses, and it goes on to quote and go on. Okay, I just want to sort of use the Ramban's own language to point that out, that the ultimate level of even the most revealed miracles is to come to the realization that everything is actually miracle in itself, and there is no such thing as nature, and that everything that happens is really a divine hand. That's the ultimate level. That is the tree of life, as opposed to the tree of we know better than God because we have knowledge of right and wrong. I want to just take a few more minutes. Everybody, I think, has a printout of the page in front of them. Yeah? Yeah, no? Okay. I'll just take a few seconds, because I just thought it'd be sort of a nice way to conclude all this. The dark part, I apologize for why this came out like this, but the dark part is the first Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, which talks about the 4 New Years, and of course, as I always love about the Talmud, the meaning you get into the Gemara, you see there are actually another 3 or 4 New Years, so it's not 4 at all, but that's just what the Mishnah said, but that's how we work. So, if you look carefully here, I'm sure a lot of you have already seen this before, but I want to show you, hopefully, a second insight. The third line towards the end there, it says, and on the Echad B'Shvat, on the first of Shvat, is the Rosh Hashanah, Le'ilan. It's the new year of the tree. It does not say plural trees. If you look at the Mishnah, everything else, Malachim, Regalim, everything else is plural. All of a sudden it comes to the new year of the tree. The language of the Mishnah is in the singular. Kedivrei Beis Shammai, that he holds that Tu B'Shvat is not Tu B'Shvat, but rather Rosh Chodesh Shvat. And Beis Hillel Omrim B'Chamish Asar Bo, the 15th day of that month, which is what we celebrate classically of that. 2 things to point out. First of all, why this singular language? And the Arizal says, because it's referring to the tree of the Garden of Eden. That Tu B'Shvat is the tikkun of the original tree of life / knowledge. And that's what we've been talking about this whole class. That's why Tu B'Shvat is the ultimate redemption. And that's why, just like there are 30 days of Somech Geula LeGeula between Pesach to Purim, there are 30 days, Purim Yerushalayim that is, because that's the main one, Shushan Purim, in terms of Tikkun, which I'm not going to go into, do that on Purim. And then 30 days,
from Purim to Pesach.
Yes? I'm going backwards though.
Going back.
Yeah. And then 30 days from Purim to Tu B'Shvat. That's the third Geula. These are the spacings between the 3 Geulot, the 30 days, 30 days, and 30 days. And this is because Tu B'Shvat is the tikkun of the original tree. That's why it's the singular. But I want to point out something else the Organ Eliyahu said, which is really interesting. Those of you that are familiar with Mishnah or Gemara have seen a gazillion times arguments between Shammai and Hillel. What is the normal lashon, the language? It's, Beis Shammai Oimrim. In fact, you have it. Look at here. Beis Hillel Oimrim. But note, it doesn't say Beis Shammai Oimrim. This is the only time in Shas, I believe, where it does not say the classical form for both Shammai and Hillel. It changes it here. It suddenly says here, Kedivrei Beis Shammai. As they say in Spanish, Vos estos? How do you have Kid Divrei Beis Shammai? And what does that normally mean? Whenever we say in Shas, Kid Divrei so-and-so, it means that the halacha is like him. So the language of the Mishnah is actually saying that the halacha is like Beis Shammai, that the holiday is really on Rosh Chodesh Shvat. But we know that it's not, because we know the halacha always follows Hillel. Until when? Until the Mashiach comes. When the Mashiach comes and the final Geula comes, then the halacha shifts to be like Shammai. And the Mishnah is hinting at it because when it comes to Tu B'Shvat, which represents the final Geula and the Mashiach, we therefore show that it really will be Kid Divrei Shammai, because that's the time we will convert. And what is the difference between Shammai and Hillel? So Shammai is from the lashon of shamua, which means to evaluate, to give a evaluation of worth. It's also what we call in English maybe as an appraisal. It's also connected in the ability of havana, of understanding on the level of shmiyah, of hearing, where Hillel is connected to the idea of hallel, when something is clearly revealed. Right? On Tu B'Shvat, the moon is a full moon. It's a full revelation. You can point to it and see it. That's Hillel. But Shammai is a higher level of knowledge. It's something that cannot necessarily be perceived or understood as clearly as the revelation of that. But we know that the whole idea of Chodesh Zeh Lechem, this will be the moon, but also in creation, it wasn't just the trees that sinned, it was the moon that sinned, that it shrunk. Now, this punishment of the moon was not correlated to man at all. It just, that's what it was. If you look carefully, Rashi points out in the word ma'orot, it's missing a vav. Vav, got that? It's missing a vav, because the word ma'orot, which means light, if you take out the word vav, means disease, sick. So the light of the moon became ill, if you will. Why? Because the vav that sits on the tree, that would be revelation to the max, so man would live in pure light and correct knowledge and know how to do right action, that moon misses that vav, it becomes shrunk. The vav that will be returned is in the very end of Tanakh, when it spells the name Eliyahu, chaser, the vav. Because that's the level when Eliyahu comes and brings the Mashiach, that's the return of the vav. And what happens to the moon? It returns to the size of the sun. That becomes the ultimate Geula. That's the tikkun of Rosh Chodesh. And that's why if you look, the language of the Karbonot of Rosh Chodesh is different than all the other Karbonot. Because the Gemara says the language was changed to something that if the Gemara didn't say it, we couldn't say it. God says, would you bring an animal for me because I sinned when I shrunk the moon? God sinned? What's that all about? I mean, we're gonna atone for him? But the answer is not that God sinned. God created this world for an opportunity for sin, for destructive nature. God set the whole thing up. He shrunk the moon. That's the world of nature. If we don't opt for the higher level of Torah, that's what it's going to be. So the moon shrunk, the tree was unable to perform, and man failed the test. Man rectifies the test, the vav returns, the moon becomes enhanced. That's the tikkun lavana. That tikkun lavana is the tikkun of the whole world. And I want to leave you with this beautiful, the first of all the Tehillim. I want to go through 1 minute with you of the Malbim, how he learns the very first Tehillim, because it's sort of a very beautiful tying this together of a relationship of man and tree and what it could mean for us ishit. By the way, there's something popped wrong on the pagination here, so it's not your eyes. It might be my eyes, but it's certainly a mistake in the computer. So you know the first Tehillim is Ashrei Ha'ish Asher. Right? Ashrei Ha'ish Asher. It's interesting, the Malbim points out you have the double language Asher. Asher as the word Ashrei and as Asher. Because Asher is basically translated as that. Meaning, the word that is a kind of cool word because it's a kind of word you can use to refer to anything. You can refer to it as a physical, I mean that thing over there, or I mean that idea, or that which once happened, or that which will happen. There's anything the mind could grasp in any space. Even if you can't identify it, you could refer to it as that. And since it's within the world of that which God created, it can be elevated through the joining of the yud, which makes it joyful, ashrei. It converts to that when everything reaches its tikkun, the result of the tikkun is joy. It brings the happiness, the ashrei. So ashrei ha'ish, the person, language ish always means master. It doesn't really mean human being, right? Hashem ish milchama. Does it mean God's a man of war? Of course not. It means God is the master of war. So it means one who's the ish of asher can create the ashrei. How? First, sur me'ra, turning from evil. 3 stages of evil. There is the Rasha whose advice we do not walk in. Note the verb, walk. There is the sinner who we do not stand in his path. So we have walking, standing, evil person, I hate these translations, but evil person, sinner. And then we have this smart aleck, the cynic, who we don't sit in the place where this person sits. So you got walking, standing, sitting. So this is a really interesting thing. If you ask your local Orthodox rabbi, who is the worst person in the world, they would probably tell you a Rasha. I don't know if King David would agree with that. King David, as you'll see in a minute, I'll prove a little bit later, would tell you worse than the Rasha, worse than the sinner is the cynic. Why? Because the Rasha is trying to do something. Yitzchak understood that Esav was a Rasha, but he had the power. He wanted to channel Esav's negative power into positive power. You can't channel nothingness into power. You can convert power into power. So Esav was out there. He was a thinking man, a feeling man, a struggling man. He had his ups, he had his downs, he had his moments of true love and true hate. He was a real human being, battling with the world. Whatever it was, he was a real being. The word Rasha comes from the word Rash. His head was filled with noise. It didn't have the clarity and the wisdom of Yaakov, but he was a man who was alive. And therefore, he's a man who is walking, he's going, but he's going the wrong way. So therefore, don't walk in that wrong way. The sinner is somebody who's paralyzed. They don't know what to do. They haven't learned. They're not ma'aretz. They don't know what halacha is. They don't know the importance of halacha. So therefore, they're not going anywhere. They're standing still. They're stuck, like a car with its tires in the mud. So therefore, with that person who's simply stuck, don't go in the way of that which will lead to nowhere. But the worst is the cynic. The cynic isn't even standing, let alone walking. He's sitting. He's the kind of guy that sits around and cuts down everybody else's legs. He's the kind of person that as soon as anybody has an idea, he says, it'll never be, it'll never happen. Right? That's the cynic. That's the worst. That person's worse than dead. Because dead, at least, is not harmful to others. But this is someone who paralyzes all creativity, all growth, all development. Now, next verse. Note here, but rather, instead of in those 3 categories, ki'im b'toras Hashem chatzo, he desires. Now note here, God's Torah, Torah's Hashem, u'b'torah so, now it switches from God's Torah to your Torah. It's not enough that, Reb Chaim Volozhin used to say, 50% of the Yetzer Hara is just to get the book off the shelf. Just to make these 2 temples, the bookends, get it all in here, not over there. So the point is that once you learn Torah, that's God's Torah, big deal. What's magic is you make it your Torah. Now you understand it according to you. That's what God delights in, to see the unique individual aspect of each of us, all working within the Dalet Amot of Halacha, but according to who we are as individuals. That place, therefore, is no matter what our matzav, day or night, right? As my rabbi once said, sometimes the light's all shining on me and other times I can barely see. So no matter what it is, I can find my Torah in my days of my life and in my night times of my life. Because now it's my Torah. And therefore it says, and alone, therefore, v'haya ke'etz, you will be like a tree, shatul, which is I forgot the word for shatul.
Planted.
Well, it's planted, but there's a word, when the trees they grow trees to a certain height. Sapling, thank you. Yes. So it'll be like a sapling, which is transplanted, al palgi mayim. The Malbim says here, what does it mean that the tree will be transplanted on divided waters? Because many people are born in a certain habitat, certain environment, a certain situation. But as they grow up, they realize, ze lo ani. Right? Like, what was that, Talking Heads? You might say, that's not my life. So what happens is you wake up one day and you realize this is really not for me. So what do? What should you do? You go and you challenge or look and investigate the different waters, the divided waters, until you find the soil and the sun and the earth and the water that's matim for where will you be happiest? Where will you grow? Where will you live your life as a tree growing to the fullest? So in other words, one should not be a product of their environment. Rather, one should choose their environment, choose where they live, and choose how they are to find the situation which is best mashpia on them. And such a person, therefore, will be pirio yite bito. The blessing of the fruit will come at its right time. The leaves will not wither. And everything that he does or she does will be successful. Look at the next verse, however. That's where it's a little messed up. The verse actually begins with the word lo kain. But for the Rishoyim, it will not be the same because they will be like chaff that will be blown away in the wind. Wind, by the way, is always a remiss to Mashiach. That at the end of the day, the Rasha will not have anything to stand on because it was never rooted in truth, which we'll see right now in the next verse. Al kain lo yakimu rishoyim b'mishpat. And since they're really not based in emet, therefore when the mishpat of the din of Mashiach will come, they will not be able to stand. And the chatoyim ba'adat tzaddikim, they will not stand in the place of standing in the tzaddikim. Now if you look again, in this verse, we've lost the cynic. He's not even, he's gone. Here at least, there will be a situation where the Rasha will ultimately realize he was wrong. There will be where the sinner will realize that he did not make the effort to go as opposed to stand still. Even if he or she failed, it's better to fail and move forward than to stand still. That person didn't reach the group of tzaddikim who were willing to fail in order to reach success. I can't remember the name of the hockey player who once said, I missed 100% of the shots I never took. Right? If you don't try, you can't succeed. If you try and you fail, so what? What happens if you fail? So you've already failed if you didn't try, so nothing's happened. But there's no way to get to yes if you don't ask. There's no way to succeed if you don't make that effort and try. But the cynic, he's gone. He's not even mentioned here in round 2. And then the last part, which ties it all together, Ki yadu Hashem derech tzadikim. Because, and this is what the Malbim points out, Hashem, God, knows the way of the tzaddik, but derech rishoyim ta'oved, and the way of the evil will destroy, will fail. So the Malbim asks the question, why does it say, and God will see that the way of the rishoyim will fail? And he answers, he doesn't need to. Because since, what does a Rasha mean? A Rasha means that he opted to live his life according to the world of this lower level of nature. And as we said at the beginning of the class, the natural nature of the world is destructive. So therefore, ultimately, he will fall into the natural order and be destroyed. The nature of the tzaddik is like the salmon swimming upstream. He's defying the law of nature. He's trying to split the sea of nature and to get to the higher level or the inner circle of Torah. And therefore, the only way that he or she can do that is with siyata d'shmaya, is with help from God. And therefore, God will help each of us if we just make the effort. That's all we have to do. It's not about being a saint. It's not about succeeding. It's about trying to push the lever to the side of holiness. And when we do that, that creates the vav, that even in our actions, the actions become aligned, and that becomes ultimately where we become like the tzaddik, or the tree that sits in the field, where we're in the playing field, where we convert those laws of nature to reveal that there are no laws of nature. It's all about God. So thank you very much, and happy Tu B'Shvat.